When, where, and why did humans first develop agriculture? Hello, and welcome back to What's Past is Prologue. This is the channel where we talk about the story of civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. And today we are continuing on Chapter 2 of Volume 1, and the first section of Chapter 2, which is called From Hunting to Tillage. In the last video, we looked at hunting, and today we're going to look at tillage, or more specifically, we're going to look at the Neolithic Revolution, and we're going to read what Durant has to say on the subject of agriculture. So this is a quote from that section by Durant. This is what he has to say. "We shall never discover when men first noted the function of the seed and turned collecting into sowing. Such beginnings are the mysteries of history, about which we may believe and guess, but cannot know. It is possible that when men began collecting unplanted grains, seeds fell along the way between field and camp, and suggested at last the great secret of growth." While we can't know for certain when agriculture began, since Durant published this first volume in the 1930s, we've actually learned quite a lot about the beginnings of agriculture. Experimentation with agriculture actually goes way back. There's an archaeological site near the Sea of Galilee which suggests that small-scale cultivation may date back all the way to 21,000 BC. By the time we get to 12,000 BC, we can see that the Natufian culture, that being the people that were living in what is today Israel-Palestine, were using wild forms of wheat, a particular wheat called emmer, which is a wild form of wheat that was being ground up using grindstones. And whilst we don't have evidence at that stage of domestication, it's pretty clear that the Natufians were experimenting with different types of agriculture. The first definite appearance of large-scale agriculture was in northwest Syria and southern Turkey in 10,000 BC. This area was called the Fertile Crescent, and by that we're talking about modern-day countries that include the likes of Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, southern Turkey, and Iraq. This Fertile Crescent is the area where agriculture first began. I thought that today we would look not only at when and where agriculture first developed, but also the types of plants that were first domesticated. The first and most important plant domestication was that of wheat. Dates are not precise, but it's believed that between 10,000 and 8,000 BC, two wild forms of wheat called emmer and einkorn, these are German names, were domesticated and adapted for human needs. The domesticated versions of emmer and einkorn aren't really cultivated so much anymore. Instead, we've replaced them with two other species of wheat, particularly common wheat and durum wheat. So common wheat and durum wheat are the two most popularly grown species of wheat in the world today. Wheat plays a pretty central role in most of our diets today. So when you think about things like bread, pasta, noodles, pizza, crackers, biscuits, pastries, they're all made using wheat. Bread, specifically, is probably the most important food in the history of the world, at least in the history of the Western world. Its importance is both practical as well as symbolic. About 20% of all the calories consumed worldwide come from foods that are made primarily out of wheat. When you're thinking about the cultural and symbolic significance of something like bread, it's not very difficult to think of examples. I mean, the most obvious example is probably from the Lord's Prayer. Everybody, even people that aren't particularly religious, know the saying, "Give us this day our daily bread." The next founder crop that I want to talk about today that was first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent is barley. Now, barley was first domesticated around 8,000 BC. It is closely related to wheat and rye. It is in the botanical tribe that is the Triticeae, so wheat, rye, and barley are all closely related. Barley is used today very commonly in animal feed, but historically it was used, and I think it still is used today, in the brewing of beer. The first example we have of anywhere in the world of the brewing of beer comes from the Sumerians. They seem to have been using barley to brew beer around 4000 BC. Two more founder crops that were first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent are lentils and chickpeas. They're both legumes, and they were domesticated between 8 and 7,000 BC. Lentils are often used in soups and stews. In my opinion, lentil soup is delicious. An interesting fact about lentils is that they're often mentioned in the Bible. So if you read 2 Samuel, you will hear about how the camp of King David, the supporters of David, brought with them lentils in order to feed everyone. This was during Absalom's rebellion. When it comes to chickpeas, they were domesticated a little bit later than lentils. One of the interesting things about chickpeas is that they are pretty central to most Middle Eastern cuisine. So if you go to the Middle East and you have hummus or falafel, one of the key ingredients is chickpeas. The final crop that I want to mention that was first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent is flax. Now, flax was domesticated around 7000 BC, and it's used for its fibers and its oil. Flax fiber is taken from the stem of the plant and is used to make linen fabric. The seeds of flax are edible, and in fact, they're a particularly healthy type of food. Today, we use flax primarily for the creation of linseed oil. If we leave the Fertile Crescent behind and head towards South America, we can find another area where agriculture developed independently. In the central Andean highlands, in the area that is now southern Peru and northern Bolivia, we find the development of new crops that were native to the Americas. Here we find that potatoes were first domesticated around 8000 BC. Potatoes, as everybody knows, are starchy root vegetables that are native to the Americas. The interesting thing about potatoes is that we don't actually eat the plant. Potato plants are actually toxic. We eat the tubers that grow below the ground. If you're going to grow potatoes in your garden, you have to be rather careful to make sure that your cats and dogs don't actually get at the plants, because it can make them quite sick. In this same region, this central Andean highlands, we find the domestication of another plant, and that being quinoa. Now, quinoa was domesticated around about 3000 BC. The interesting thing about quinoa is that it's actually a complete protein. The human body cannot make all of the essential amino acids that it needs to survive, and so we have to rely on diet in order to find these 9 essential amino acids. Quinoa has all 9, and so quinoa is actually a very useful food for vegetarians and vegans who don't get enough of these essential amino acids from protein because they don't eat meat. If we leave South America behind and head north, we can find another area where agriculture developed independently, that being Mesoamerica. Now, Mesoamerica is really made up of places that we think of today as Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, places like this in Central America, Central Southern America. Here in Mesoamerica, we find the first domestication of maize, otherwise called corn. Maize was first domesticated in Mexico around 7000 BC. It reached Central America by 5600 BC, and it reached the valleys of the Colombian Andes by 5000 BC. Most modern maize is the ancestor of domesticated wild grasses called teosinte. Maize is a major staple crop used around the world. Maize is obviously a key ingredient in Mexican food, but you can find maize in lots of other places too. So most breakfast cereals are made out of maize, as is popcorn. Obviously, corn on the cob is maize. Maize was very important in terms of Mayan mythology. There was actually a maize god in Mayan mythology. Another crop originating in the Americas was squash. Squash was first domesticated in Mexico between 8000 and 6000 BC. Squash is one of the crops known as the Three Sisters in Central and North America. Squash, maize, and beans were planted together, and they help each other to grow. The ways in which the Three Sisters crops help each other is like this. So first of all, the corn stalk will grow, and this acts as a windbreak to protect the other two crops. It also acts as a trellis, which allows the beans to grow around the corn stalk, and they grow up too. The beans will then provide atmospheric nitrogen to the soil, which helps all three crops grow. When the squash is larger, the squash provides shade, which protects the ground from drying out. It keeps the ground nice and moist, which provides water for all three crops. The stems of the squash are also prickly, and this keeps away pests. And so each one of these crops actually is mutually beneficial to the other, and that's why they're traditionally grown all together. Beans and chili peppers were also both first domesticated in Mesoamerica. Beans are obviously legumes, and they were first domesticated between 7000 and 6000 BC, and chili peppers were first domesticated a little bit later, around 4000 BC. The interesting thing about chili peppers is obviously they're famous for their spiciness, but spiciness can be measured. So when you want to measure the spiciness of a food, it's measured on what's known as the Scoville scale. The final area that I want to talk about in terms of the independent development of agriculture is out east, and that's in China. When and where exactly rice was first domesticated has become something of a controversial topic. Given rice's huge symbolic as well as practical significance, many nations have claimed that they were the first to domesticate rice. These nations include, but are not limited to, India, Nepal, Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, Japan, among others. We may never have a definitive answer as to who domesticated rice first. It may be the case that rice was developed independently at several locations. However, insofar as there is a consensus, that consensus is that rice was first domesticated in the Yangtze River Basin in China between 11,500 BC and 7,000 BC. Rice is a cereal grain and a staple food for more than half of the world's population. It's been estimated that, like wheat, 20% of the world's caloric intake comes from rice. That percentage obviously rises significantly when you're just thinking about Asia. Today, we have thousands of different varieties of rice. Rice cultivation is very water intensive. For at least part of the growing season, the rice fields are flooded. Given the large amounts of water required for irrigation, there are concerns about how rice cultivation will adapt to climate change. The second crop I want to talk about in relation to China is millet. Now, millet is a name that's given to a collection of small-seeded grasses. One of the most common types of millet is foxtail millet. This is used in porridge, it's used to make beer. It's most commonly used these days for animal feed. Millet was domesticated between 8000 and 6000 BC in the Yellow River Valley. Millet in some ways stands in contrast to rice in the sense that it's capable of being grown in areas that are particularly prone to drought. The final crop that I want to talk about in relation to China is obviously tea. Tea has been cultivated in China for thousands of years, but its domestication seems to have started around 3000 BC. Chinese legend has it that Emperor Shennong discovered tea in the year 2737 BC, when some tea leaves accidentally fell into a pot of boiling water that he was preparing. The emperor found the drink so refreshing that he concluded that tea was a gift from heaven. These four regions, the Fertile Crescent, the Peruvian Andes, Mesoamerica, and China, these aren't the only regions where agriculture developed independently. These are just four areas that I thought I would mention specifically. It's also worth mentioning that agriculture seems to have arisen independently in New Guinea around 8000 BC, as well as in the Indus Valley around 7000 BC. At the same sort of time in Egypt, 7000 BC, we see the Egyptians cultivating emmer wheat and barley and flax. Now, the interesting thing, Egypt's a really interesting case because it's not 100% clear whether they developed these independently or whether they were diffused there from the Fertile Crescent. It's a really interesting question about exactly how agriculture began in Egypt. Much later, agriculture also developed in the Ethiopian highlands. This is the region where coffee was first domesticated. When it comes to Europe, agriculture seems to have arrived first in Anatolia and then gradually spread westward over the next 2,500 years. I've talked a little bit about cultivation and domestication, and I thought it might be useful to try and define these terms a little bit. So when it comes to cultivation, what we're talking about here is we till the soil, we plant the seeds, we're deliberately trying to grow crops in order to get a harvest. That's what we do with regards to cultivation. But when it comes to domestication, this is a similar process but slightly different in the sense that with domestication, we are deliberately selecting certain traits within the plants. We want the plant to be a certain way, and so we select that trait, and we hope that that trait will be therefore reproduced in future yields. So domestication crucially involves selection. Another term worth thinking about is the term cultivar. So cultivar is a portmanteau term for cultivated variety. So when you think about crops, we have particular cultivated varieties. We have chosen certain traits within that crop that we wanted to cultivate. So a cultivar is a cultivated variety. When we're talking about the Neolithic Revolution, the most important trait that we deliberately domesticated for was non-shattering. Wheat, barley, rice, soybean, sunflower, flax, all of these plants in their wild forms are shattering. They shatter and they disperse their seeds. But we deliberately selected non-shattering versions of those plants, and that is what we domesticated. And we did this because non-shattering plants are easier to harvest, and because we wanted to also control the seeds. Signs of non-shattering in plants is one of the key factors that paleobotanists look for when they're trying to determine exactly when domestication began. Domestication was a very slow process. It took thousands of years and involved an enormous amount of experimentation. And I'm going to read to you now a quote from Durant where he talks about some of this experimentation. We picture early man experimenting with 1,000 products of the earth to find, at much cost to his inward comfort, which of them could be eaten safely, mingling these more and more with the fruits and nuts, the flesh and fish which he was accustomed to, but always yearning for the booty of the chase. We shouldn't think of domestication as common. There are somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 plant species, and of those we have domesticated about 300, so that's about 1 in 1,000. And even of those, there is only about 30 crops of global significance. When we ask ourselves the question, why did certain regions develop agriculture sooner than others? It's important to remember that certain plants are easier to domesticate than others. And so the Fertile Crescent had lots of plants that were easier to domesticate. This is one of the major reasons why that region was first in terms of development of agriculture. People in the Paleolithic had a pre-existing knowledge of plants and animals, and so it's quite likely that they knew how to grow crops thousands of years before they fully adopted agriculture. You can imagine a scenario where Paleolithic people discover how to grow crops. So suppose that they were out gathering wild barley and they bring it back to the camp and they decide to bury it underground in order to prevent rats from getting at it. And so after a few months, the barley grows out, and then suddenly they've discovered that if we bury barley seeds, we can regularly grow crops. If hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic knew, potentially thousands of years before they fully adopted agriculture, how to grow crops, then it begs the question, well, why didn't they develop agriculture sooner? Well, I think this is a pretty simple explanation for this. They didn't need to. They had a system in hunting and gathering that worked, and since it worked, why would you change it? And Durant writes a little bit about this in this section, and I'm going to read another quote to you. He says this: "Not only was the change presumably gradual, but it was never complete. Man merely added a new way of securing food to an old way. And for the most part, throughout his history, he has preferred the old food to the new." If Durant is right here, and mankind preferred the old ways of securing food, then it does raise the question, why did we transition to agriculture? The first thing that strikes you about this question is the extent to which the beginnings of agriculture also matches up with the beginnings of the Holocene. So we enter this interglacial period, and if you don't know about the interglacial periods in the Holocene, I would recommend going back to a previous video I made called The Conditions of Civilization, where I talk about that there. But we enter the interglacial period, and at the same time agriculture begins. So the planet warms, and we begin agriculture. So it does seem very strange if these two things are not related. We have to be very careful of post hoc ego propter hoc fallacies and not engaging in fallacious reasoning when we think about something causing another thing. But it does seem very strange that these two things are absolutely lined up in terms of the time frame. At the end of the Ice Age, the planet warmed up, and we had a long, stable climate. And so this created the ideal conditions for agriculture, particularly near major rivers. Now, given that the agriculture first developed around the Fertile Crescent, and given in this region we have two major rivers in the Euphrates and the Tigris, it would be a major surprise if these things had nothing to do with each other. Climate may have been a cause, but what are the other theories that have been suggested as to why we adopted agriculture? One idea that's been suggested is that individual leaders wanted to demonstrate their power by feasting large numbers of people, and that in order to do this, they had to develop agriculture in order to grow the food that was necessary to feed these people. So it's a form of status. Now, this may seem like a far-fetched idea, but how much of the things that go on in the modern world are simply done because somebody is trying to show off? Another theory is this idea that demographic pressure simply pushed people towards agriculture. Perhaps there were too many people in one area, hunting and gathering wasn't able to sustain the whole population, so some people turned to agriculture. This then led to increases in population, which created more demand for agriculture, and so the adoption of agriculture became self-reinforcing. One interesting question is with regards to sedentism. Did people settle down and adopt agriculture, or did they adopt agriculture and then settle down? One place we might be able to find an answer to this question is in Göbekli Tepe. Built in 9500 BC in the pre-pottery Neolithic, it's become a major archaeological site. The excavation of this large site in southern Turkey has raised a lot of questions. First of all, it seems that the site was built before the adoption of agriculture. But that raises the question, how were the workers who built this site fed? This site is so large that it would have taken hundreds, if not thousands, of workers to build, and they would have all needed to be fed. And if hunting and gathering was insufficient, one proposed solution to this problem is that people adopted agriculture in order to feed workers who were building sites on this scale. Göbekli Tepe is unlikely to be the beginnings of agriculture. In fact, it's quite likely that there are other sites on a similar scale that have yet to be discovered right the way across the Middle East. But what Göbekli Tepe does prove is that sedentism came before agriculture. We settled down, then we adopted agriculture. When I was reading about Göbekli Tepe, one of the things that interested me is I wondered what Durant would have made of it. Now, the site was identified in the 1960s, but it wasn't properly excavated until the 1990s. And so by this time, Durant had been dead for more than a decade. And so he didn't know about the site's significance. But if he had have done, I'm certain he would have written about it in this volume, in the first volume to the series. There's no doubt that a site on this kind of scale wouldn't have interested him. And so I think he would have covered it extensively. But again, the book came out in the 1930s and the site wasn't excavated until 1994. If we go back to sedentism for a moment, it's interesting because I said in the last video that nomadic peoples adopted a high rate of senilicide and infanticide. But of course, that isn't necessary once you adopt sedentism. Once you adopt sedentism, it isn't difficult to move people because you're not moving large distances. In a sedentary agricultural community, children are a huge economic asset, and so there's no need to practice infanticide at such a high rate. When it comes to the study of the human prehistory, some early anthropologists had believed that there was some individual genius who had created, seemingly out of the blue, agriculture, and that from this one individual, the knowledge of agriculture had spread right the way around the world. Most anthropologists and historians and archaeologists don't really believe in this sort of individual genius theory anymore, partly because we know that agriculture developed in different places at different times independently, and partly because now anthropologists and historians and archaeologists, they tend to focus less on individuals and they focus more on environmental conditions. What's interesting to me about this is that it's almost certainly wrong in the sense that there must have been individuals who first discovered agriculture. We can't say that they were geniuses. We don't know their names. We can't really say very much about them at all. They may have been men, they may have been women. We don't really know. But there would have had to have been multiple individuals at different places in the world. There would have been somebody in China, somebody in the Fertile Crescent, someone in Mesoamerica and in the Andes, who was the first person to discover agriculture. We don't know their significance, and we don't know whether anyone paid any attention to them, but there would have been individuals who would have pioneered this transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. One of the questions that this all relates to is this idea of diffusion. Was agriculture developed in certain places and then diffused outward? Well, it almost certainly was, but it didn't diffuse right the way around the world. What we said earlier with regards to Europe is that agriculture seems to have spread to Anatolia, and then from there it diffused right the way across Europe, although it took thousands of years. So diffusion certainly did take place, although it didn't take place globally, but it would have taken place regionally. When we ask ourselves why did we adopt agriculture? One potential answer to that question may be to challenge the premise of the question. That is to say, perhaps there was no deliberative and conscious choices made in the adoption of agriculture. When we ask a question like why, we assume that people are making choices, but perhaps there were no very thought through and deliberative choices being made as we adopted it gradually. I've talked about different theories in this video, but it's important to keep in mind that there are cultural and environmental variations right the way around the world, and so one theory that works for the Fertile Crescent might not work for China. And so we have to keep in mind that when we come up with these theories, they may not be globally applicable. Another thing to keep in mind is we might just be in a situation where we don't really definitively know why we transitioned. There are multiple theories. Some of them may be true. Maybe it's a combination of different theories. But we might have to live with the possibility that we don't definitively know why this transition took place. When we're thinking about the Neolithic Revolution, we may not fully understand why it happened, but we can really begin to understand what impact it had. And the impact has been enormous. The Neolithic Revolution is probably the biggest change in human history. Now, when we're thinking about the Neolithic Revolution, we should divide its impact into its short-term impact and then its long-term impact. The immediate impact of the Neolithic Revolution was overwhelmingly negative. We went from having a diverse diet as hunter-gatherers to having a much more limited diet as agriculturalists. This more limited diet damaged human health. The switch to a high-carbohydrate, low-fiber, low-protein diet lowered the average height of the population. It also damaged teeth. It increased child mortality, and it lowered life expectancy. Increasing urbanization led to more interactions between people, as well as more interactions with domesticated animals, and this led to increases in disease and high levels of infection. Crop yields were vulnerable to bacteria, viruses, rodents, insects, and fungi. This led to occasional declines in crop yields and famine. The physical activity of farming was also detrimental to the human body. Moving around as hunter-gatherers was much more healthy, and so we see a general decline in human health. It is for these reasons that we don't see a large-scale increase in the population after the adoption of agriculture. It is a gradual increase. It takes some 6,000 years after the Neolithic Revolution before we get to widespread large civilizations like the Sumerians. However, gradually things do improve. We become better at farming, we diversify our diets via trade, we develop new tools, and so the longer-term impact of the Neolithic Revolution is much more positive. And Durant talks about this in the volume, and I'm going to read another quote. Slowly, it became apparent that agriculture could provide a better and steadier food supply than hunting. With that realization, man took one of the 3 steps that led from the beast to civilization: speech, agriculture, and writing. The long-term impact of the Neolithic Revolution has been enormous. Once we began to diversify our diets, the population began its rapid ascent. We went from 4 million prior to the Neolithic Revolution to 8 billion people today. And Durant talks a little bit about this in a future section, and I'm going to read what he says here. Before agriculture, the Earth could have supported, in the rash estimate of Sir Arthur Keith, only some 20 million men, and the lives of these were shortened by the mortality of the chase and war. Now began that multiplication of mankind, which definitely confirmed man's mastery of the planet. Agriculture led to more people, and as there were more people, this increased the possibility of new ideas. As farming spread around the world, it had to be adapted to different environments, and this ushered in a new wave of technology. It was no longer the case that we were limited to light objects like the spear or the bow and arrow. After we abandoned nomadism, we were capable of increasing the amount of possessions that people had. New tools were needed for agriculture, and this really began and precipitated the enormous technological revolution that we still see today, with exponential technological growth. Another long-term impact of the Neolithic Revolution was the emergence of distinct classes among people. We began to see social hierarchies. The need to store grain led to centralized power structures and urbanization. Agricultural surpluses meant that fewer people had to work on the land, and what we began to see is this general shift towards urbanization. This is a trend that continues today. Now we have more than half of the world's population living in urban areas. But when you take urbanization combined with the need to store grain, we begin to see the emergence of what we think of today as architecture. Agricultural surpluses are really the foundation of the field of economics. Once you have either surpluses or scarcity, these are key factors in terms of pricing. Once you have surpluses, though, you can allow for division of labor, which lets people specialize in different trades. These people can produce different varieties of goods, which can be traded between groups. So we should see surpluses as the foundation not just of the field of economics, but also of the field of trade. It's not to say that trade and economics didn't exist before the Neolithic Revolution. They did, but they just accelerated dramatically after the Neolithic Revolution. Rules are also needed for the distribution of the surplus. As well, you need rules for the inheritance of farmland. So when you think about these rules, these are really the beginnings of what we think of today as the field of law. Ancestor cults developed quickly after the Neolithic Revolution, and you can see ancestor cults in lots of different parts of the world. One of the reasons that this happened is because of the class distinctions which emerged after the Neolithic Revolution. So we go from being hunter-gatherers with greater degrees of equality to a society where your authority is often based on your ancestry. And so in an environment where ancestry is crucial to your social status, it's not really surprising that we see the emergence of ancestor cults which reinforce this social hierarchy. Grain needed to be stored. And so after the Neolithic Revolution, we begin to see the emergence of pottery. Now, pottery is very useful in that after 6000 BC, you can start to track different cultural changes within a society based on pottery styles. Hunter-gatherers had been adapting the land for their own uses for thousands of years, but it's really only after the Neolithic Revolution that we start to see the radical transformation of the environment, the intensification of land use. If you look at a scene like this, it may seem like it's a very natural landscape, but in fact, nothing about this landscape is natural at all. Every part of this landscape has been heavily altered and adapted for human use. We're so used to seeing landscapes like this, we just assume that this is natural, but there's nothing natural about this at all. To say that there aren't many places left on Earth that are unspoiled by mankind would be a pejorative statement. It's not that transformation of the environment is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a necessary thing for our civilization to survive. It's just that when you look around at the world, wherever you seek ugliness, it's usually a product of human beings. Nature itself doesn't really produce a lot of natural ugliness. The scale of the impact that human beings have had on the environment is something that people have become very aware of and very interested in the 21st century. And so it's possible that this will be the century where we finally begin to scale back our effect on the environment. So social hierarchies, inequality, division of labor, economics, architecture, law, pottery, the transformation of the environment. These are just some of the ways in which the Neolithic Revolution has transformed our lives. So why did farming communities ultimately displace hunter-gatherers? Well, in the end, food surpluses paid off. It led to larger populations, which meant that farming communities were better able to protect their lands from attacks by hunter-gatherers, and it also meant that as the population grew, farming communities spread out, gradually displacing hunter-gatherers. After generations of working on the land, farmers forgot the skills necessary for foraging and hunting. In time, it must have seemed that farming is how life had always been, and always would be. Some people have questioned whether there really was a Neolithic Revolution. This is really a semantic debate about the nature of the word revolution. Is a gradual revolution a contradiction in terms? The Neolithic Revolution certainly was revolutionary, but was it rapid enough to really be considered a revolution? So that's the Neolithic Revolution. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about the domestication of animals, and then we're going to move on to the next section of the book, which is called The Foundations of Industry. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.